Hey, Indian Creek 8th grade students, it's Professor Blazek, and I'd like to welcome you to the final installment in our social studies video series looking at the expansion west and age of American industry. In this video, we're going to be looking at industrial workers and the lives of all the people who were working in America during this time period. The guiding question that I would like you to keep in mind as you watch is, what was life like for industrial workers during this time? Now, even though the industrial age made goods more available and affordable, saw the rise of some really powerful companies, some great new inventions, industrial workers often suffered during this time period. And one reason they suffered is that they often had to work for 10 to 12 hours per day, 6 days per week. So you're looking at 60 to 70 hours per week compared to the typical 40-hour work week of today. In addition, workers could be fired for any reason or replaced with immigrants who would work for lower pay. So there was very minimal job security present during this time. And if workers began to slow down, if they got hurt, or if they began to demand more money, odds were they were going to lose their job, and there was not going to be any type of compensation for them losing their job. In addition, working conditions were often unhealthy or unsafe during this time. In the steel industry, burns were very common and very, very dangerous. In garment making businesses, there was a major fire hazard because obviously they're working with fabric. If something were to catch on fire, it would not take very long for an entire building to just completely go up. These are just a couple of examples of the unhealthy or unsafe working conditions that were common during this time. In addition, as we've talked about before, there were no laws present that really regulated business. And so this is why workers could be forced to work 60 to 70 hours per week. This is why working conditions could be so unsafe, because there was no penalty for businesses to worry about with unsafe working conditions or with people working that long. So this was a major detriment to industrial workers during this time. Now, as I just talked about, many companies would hire immigrants as a form of cheap labor during this time. And the reason that immigrants were becoming more and more common in America is that they often left hardship in their home countries and came to America looking for a better life, as though America was the land of opportunity. And companies could get away with paying immigrants less because they knew that the immigrants would eventually have to give in because they needed the job and they needed the money to support themselves and their families. Now, immigrants in the workforce during this time often faced discrimination and hatred from other workers who felt that immigrants were stealing jobs of other Americans. And unfortunately, this is really not that different than what we still see sometimes today. This idea that immigrants are stealing jobs from other Americans. And this, even though the immigrants didn't really do anything to bring it on, this was reality for a very large number of immigrants in America during this time period. Now, women and children also began to join the workforce in much larger numbers during this time. But because there were no laws that regulated workers' salaries, women usually made just half as much as men did during this time. So I know we've talked in the past about how even today women only make 80 cents for every dollar that a man makes in America. But during this time, it was literally only half, which is just unbelievable. And then in reaction to the number of children who began to join the workforce, some states did begin to pass child labor laws, such as saying that children must be 12 years old or that they could only work for 10 hours per day. But many companies would just ignore these laws because, as we talked about before, there was really no penalty in place for companies that would break these laws. So it was not uncommon for children to work under the age of 12 or to have to work 60 or 70 hours per week during this time period. So some major obstacles that were being faced by both women and children who entered into the workforce. Now, in reaction to the unfair and unsafe working conditions that were present during this time, workers would organize themselves into what are called labor unions. And labor unions are groups of workers who demanded better pay, shorter hours, and safer working conditions. And originally, unions would only represent one trade. For example, you would have steel workers, and that would be the only people in a union would be steel workers. And then you would have another union for garment makers. But eventually, unions began to expand and represent multiple trades, and this would actually give unions more influence because there were more people who were involved in them. Now, what would happen when companies began to fire workers or lower wages or increase hours? Unions would act by striking. And a couple of important examples of strikes during this time will be discussed next. The first one was the Haymarket Riot, which took place in Chicago in 1886. Workers were on strike in this area during this time, and 4 of these striking workers were killed. And then, after police ordered that the strikers broke up, somebody threw a bomb that killed a police officer, and this set off a deadly riot. The Haymarket Riot, kind of a blemish on the history of Chicago, was one of the deadliest strikes from this time period. Another famous strike from this time period was the Homestead Strike, which took place in Homestead, Pennsylvania in 1892. And this steelworkers strike from Andrew Carnegie's steel company led to the company bringing in non-union workers and armed guards. And this led to a deadly riot. And the steel union really lost a lot of power because they looked so bad in this strike and eventual riot. So unfortunately, strikes and then the riots that would ensue were not always very good during this time period, but leading up till today, labor unions still have a great deal of power, and they still use strikes to get their goals met by businesses even to this day. And this is when labor unions first became created during this era of big business. So that's all I have for you in this video. We will end it once again with the guiding question. I hope you've enjoyed our video series looking at Expansion West and the age of American business. Until next time, this has been Professor Blazek signing off.